ready to go. So here you go, Robert Lipson.
Well, thank you, Jim. Once again, I'll echo Jim. Thank you all for coming back for day 2 of our amazing conference. And showing up, I talked about yesterday, showing up with your 2 feet and voting for the future of our industry by being present and part of meetings like this. Once again, my name is Robert Lipson. I am the Pacific Northwest Lenders Conference co-chair, but I also have a day job, and that day job is I run the Northwest for Flagstar Bank. And Flagstar Bank is this morning's sponsor of Zillow and Kwame Donaldson, and we're very excited to be part of this event and sponsor it, etc. Let me get down what you just did, Mindy. Sorry about that, guys. I just lost my bio. Okay, so once again, we are extremely excited to have a real estate specialist as big as Zillow involved in today's event. So thank you, Zillow, for being involved. But also, the most important is our speaker today, Kwame Donaldson. I'm going to read his bio real quick, but we're extremely excited to have Kwame here and Zillow as part of our conference. Kwame Donaldson is a senior economist at Zillow, where he specializes in researching and explaining localized housing prices and sales trends. Prior to Zillow, he worked at Moody's Analytics, where he automated monthly production of the firm's house price forecast for all 50 states in the nation, plus 400 plus metro areas, 6,000 zip codes at various price tiers, and for multiple stress testing scenarios. Before that, Kwame worked at Moody's. He worked at the US Census Bureau, helping to design and conduct research using the American Housing Survey. Kwame holds a Ph.D. in economics from Georgia State University and an MBA from Georgia Tech. We are extremely excited to hear from Kwame this morning and hear about the Pacific Northwest housing and Zillow. Thank you very much, Kwame. We're excited to hear you. Go ahead and take over.
So again, I am Kwame. I just wanted to stress here on this very first slide that my email address is kwamed@zillow.com. So if you have questions about things that I discussed, or you perhaps want to follow up with, and we didn't get a chance today, by all means, reach out to that email address, and happy to discuss further anything that we talk about today. All right, so I am going to discuss some trends in the owner-occupied housing market. And, you know, Zillow, as I'm sure you would, it doesn't surprise you to learn, Zillow has a huge database of owner-occupied and renter-occupied housing statistics that we collect and publish and analyze every month. I'm going to focus on the owner-occupied housing market because you guys are the mortgage lenders conference. I assume that the owner-occupied segment is a more important segment for you. I'm going to start with some insights on the nationwide housing market, and I want to emphasize it's nationwide at the start. All of the slides that I talk about in the first 2 sections will be from research and trends that we see across the entire nation. I will then talk about some forecast considerations, things that we think about when we start to build our forecasts for the next year. Our forecasts are 12-month forecasts. And then I will also focus on some things we're noticing in the Pacific Northwest housing market specifically. And that's where we're headed today. If you have questions, I'm not sure you can, it sounds like the Zoom is such that anyone can chime in. I'm not sure I'll be able to see you necessarily, but if you have questions, certainly, you know, I'll stop regularly and ask 4 questions. But if you have questions along the way, by all means, let me know. All right,
Kwame, we'll hold the question and answer to the end, and we're holding them in the chat box. So if people have questions, they will be in the bottom right-hand corner. Mindy will collect them, and we will ask them at the end, if that's okay.
Also fine.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
All right, so starting with the nationwide housing market. The thing I want to emphasize first here is how, and this doesn't surprise, I'm sure, anyone at this conference, that home value growth lately has been setting records. Zillow has records going back to the late 1990s. And we've never seen, over those last 25 years, we've never seen home values grow as fast as they're growing currently. So record home value growth is possibly a record for the entire, for entire American history. I mean, we don't know. We don't have data that goes back, farther than 1990. But fast home value growth in, by any measure, 15% over the last 12 months. That's nationwide. And one of the reasons why home values are growing so sharply is that months of supply is down. And you can see that in general, there's this inverse relationship between months of supply and house price growth. When there's a lot of supply, home values grow more slowly. When there's little supply like there is now, home values grow fast. And I do want to make a note about this months of supply statistic. What that measures actually is the amount of supply necessary to meet current demand, right? So that could be called, this is a statistic that the National Association of Realtors has been publishing for years and years and years. This could be a measure called months of demand. I mean, it's sort of a ratio really of supply over demand. And so it would be just as accurate to say there's 2 months of demand. So really the question here is, what is going on in the market? Is it that demand is really high, or is it supply? A lot of people are arguing that supply is really low. So I plan to answer that question by the end of this presentation. That's one takeaway that you'll get from me. But that'll be the end. Moving along to the next slide here. Hey, there we go. That went a little too far. So this is a very interesting. So maybe I'm answering the question right now. I said, is it that the supply is high, or is it demand is high or supply is low? Here, this slide says that maybe supply is fine. This is a new for sale inventory that's coming onto the market. And what we see here in 2021 is that new for sale supply, these are listings that are flowing into the MLS databases. That flow is as high in 2021. It's a little bit lower. We've shaved off a point or two, but it's basically as high as it's been over the last couple of years. That is to say that the flow of listings coming into the market is roughly what it's been recently. And we're seeing that the seasonal trend is also pretty consistent. There's less supply in the winter. It starts ramping up in the spring. It peaks in late spring. By late summer, which is where we are now, it starts to taper off, and then the cycle starts over again. So anyway, the point here is that the for sale inventory, the amount of listings coming to the market is kind of in line with what we've seen lately. But inventory levels are indeed low. So the flow is high, but the stock is low. The stock of homes that are available for sale is quite low. So what explains this? I mean, why do we have this? What is the, it is the case that there are, nearly half as many homes now on the market as there were around this time 2 years ago. We know why things were so low last year. I mean, it was COVID. Why are things, what's the pressure on the market today? So that's another question that I'm going to answer by the end of this presentation. All right, so that gives us good context. That gets us all set up. So before I answer those questions about is it supply or demand, is it why is the flow so great but the stock so low? Before I answer those questions, I want to give some more forecast considerations. And that's where we are now. Again, all of the slides that I'm talking about in these first two sections are for the entire nation. These are U.S. national points. I guess I should point out that I guess a lot of you guys are in Washington State. I'm just outside of Washington D.C. So a lot of the the lesser Washington, there are other ways to describe, I guess, this Washington. I'll just stick with lesser. So a lot of the data that I'm looking at is for the entire nation. And here's some forecast considerations. So this is probably a slide that's also not news to a lot of you. Millennials are the largest generation in the American population. There are more millennials living today than there are any other generational cohort, and it's it's by a pretty good margin too. I mean, the number of millennials is much higher than other generations. I'm Generation X. You can see that we're really small, sort of sandwiched in between this large cohort of boomers and this even larger cohort of millennials. One thing that we know about millennials is that, they're aging, they're coming very close to the age where people typically buy their home for the first time. The average, there's more 30-year-olds in the population now than any other age. The age at which people start, putting down payments on homes, more than half people, that's around 34. And so we're coming up on that point in just a few years. But it's not yet. So I'm talking about forecast considerations here. This big wave of millennial home buyers, it's on its way, but it's not going to happen over the next year. The year horizon is the horizon that Zillow really focuses on when we do our forecast. So over the next year, we're not going to see, eventually, certainly, we're going to see a wave of millennials sort of boosting home prices up. And it's already happened to some, but over the next year, it won't be happening even more. We also see that boomers so these are retirees, people who are recently or about to retire, mostly, generally. Boomers are also a really big cohort, and they also, because they're so large, can drive house prices, house price demand, or housing demand, especially in places like Arizona and Florida, where retirees, that are retiree havens, essentially. So that's important to note, but it's also important to note that the decision to move for retirement can be put off. It's not likely that someone who is buying their retirement home, a lot of those people aren't going to get into these bidding wars that we're seeing in the other parts of the housing market right now. So a person who's looking to retire, they can wait for the market to cool down a bit. Someone who's looking to buy because they're having their first child, or because they just got married, these huge life changes are happening, in their around in their 30s. These for millennials, these are things that can't wait they can't wait as long. So you put these two things together. I guess the point I want to make is that the forecast as a result of demographics is moderating. There will be a boom in house prices, but that's not going to happen until millennials really age into the peak home buying age, in a few years. And there might also be a boom from retirees, but that's unlikely to happen in a market that's already booming. So if we're looking just at the demographic piece, you think that you would assume that home prices will moderate as a result. All right, so that's enough of that. Moving right along to interest rates. So this is another slide that I'm sure is not going to surprise most of this audience. Interest rates now are basically, they're hovering around historic lows. 2.88% was last week's number. So that's an extremely low value, and there's research that says that when interest rates are this low, that half percentage point increase can decrease house prices by 14%. So, I mean, I don't we'll talk about that in a second, but if that's the case, that is enough by itself to erase all of the gains that we saw over the last year. There is also research that just came out from the New York Fed just last week. The New York Fed is arguing that that number is vastly overestimated, 10 times more than what it really is the case. But in any case, any sort of house price decline in this regime where house prices have been increasing by double digits, any sort of decline would be very striking. So we don't think that a rise in interest rates is unlikely to cause a decline. There's too many other things going on in the housing market. But it will contribute to slower house prices. Again, this is another moderating effect in our forecast. I mean, interest rates are so low right now, it's hard to imagine them going much lower. You tend to think that if the Phillips curve, this relationship between unemployment and interest rates still is real, that you tend to think that the interest rate, that low unemployment will drive interest rates higher. The Fed behavior should also, point to higher interest rates, over the next short term or so. So interest rates should increase, and that will likely lower demand for housing. Why will that lower demand for housing? That's actually what this next slide is. Interest rates factor into mortgage affordability, and you can see right now, because interest rates are so low, even though house prices have been rising, at 14%, interest rates are so low that there's a big gap between renting and owning a home. That the mortgage cost is only 17% compared to rent, which is 30%, and the 30% of income. And that's a pretty wide gap historically. You can see back in the 90s and at the early part of this century, early 2000s, the price, the advantage that you had from mortgaging versus renting wasn't all that. It was there. It was there most of those years, but it was smaller. Now we have a wider difference in that affordability. This is one of the reasons why, when you have low interest rates, I know that I'm explaining very basic concepts to this advanced audience, but just to sort of a level set, it's because low interest rates make housing so affordable that we would expect a rise in interest rates to sort of moderate house price demand. That affordability gap will shrink. All right, so that's interesting. Moving right along here. So this is another discussion on affordability. And this is a research that we did here at Zillow in combination with National Van Lines, which is a huge nationwide moving company. And I think this is a very interesting result. So the bar graph, the chart on the left shows the advantage that people who are moving, interstate movers, gain from the move in terms of the size of the home. And you can see that over we looked at the last 5 years of data, 5 years of results, and we find that it's usually the case that when a person moves to a new zip, they're moving to a zip code where housing is bigger. So we assume they're moving to bigger houses. And that's been true. That was true in 2016. It was more true in 2018, 2019, but it is even more true today. So people are moving into houses, that are significantly, 33 square feet is not it's not a large size, but you can see that in the context of history, it's a much bigger increase than we've seen in the past. And these people here are not only getting bigger homes, you can see in the bar graphs on the right that they're paying less. They're moving to zip codes where the price of the home is less, and that hasn't always been true. If you look at 2016 to 2019, they're basically moving to zip codes that are roughly the same, where homes are selling for roughly the same amount as the zip codes they left. But in 2020, they get this $25,000 bonus. So they sell their house in a zip code and get this and buy a new house where average homes are $25,000 or more less than the zip code that they moved from. And you can see here that's a huge change. And what explains this change? This change is because when people now, there's more acceptance of teleworking now. People before, when they would move, if a person had to live in a zip code, near the center city so that they can have a short commute to work, a high income earner who is, spending, an hour or 2 hours each way in traffic. I mean, that's a huge cost a huge opportunity cost for such a person. But there is no opportunity cost if your office is like my office. I mean, I'm actually in our bedroom. So I had a very short commute to work today. And so you can imagine that the people who can now work from anywhere, Zillow is calling this the great reshuffling. People who can work from anywhere are choosing homes that are bigger and less costly, but in the suburbs. They don't have to worry about spending more money because they want a shorter commute. So what effect does this have on our forecast? Well, people are moving into cheaper homes. That should be a moderating, that should have a moderating effect on our house price forecast, especially. But I will point out that when economists look at house prices, what we do is we use this technique, this repeat sales method technique, where we look at the same home that has sold in different periods. So, so if we didn't do that, if we just looked at homes that were, if we looked at the average sale price or the median sale price, which is a measure that's often reported in the media, if we just looked at those statistics, then we could suffer from these mix effects, these composition effects. So that people who are buying cheaper homes in the suburbs, it looks like house prices are declining because of that, even if that home that they are purchasing in suburbs is selling for 15% more than it did last time. So economists tend not to use that method when we look at house price growth. We use this repeat sales method that controls for these mix effects, where if you're looking at the same property and its growth over time, and then essentially averaging over all of those values, you get a result that is sort of resistant to these compositional issues that you might otherwise, detect. So anyway, more affordability is a result of people moving, of the great reshuffling. Moving along. Oh, here's another. So I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because I love it so much. There's a lot of data here. The main thing that I want to sort of get across is that there's been this forbearance program that these legal restrictions on foreclosing on households. Again, I'm sure I don't have to dwell too much on that aspect to this audience. Legal restrictions on foreclosing on distressed homeowners during COVID. But those restrictions are expiring, and we've sort of estimated the effect of those expiring protections over housing supply over the next year. So the middle column here, this 25% scenario column, that is the 25% is what we have observed. That's the amount of homes that go onto the market after the last year when people have exited these programs. So it's sort of the status quo scenario. If things are in the future the way they've been in the past, this is the result that we expect. And the long and short of it is this: that house pricing, that the housing market there'll be the months of supply will increase by 4/10. So a small increase in months of supply in housing, and that's about 13% of the homes that would typically sell over 3 months, over the September to October period. So, you know, a substantial increase in sales there. I will just sort of point out for completeness, we have this 10% scenario. That's assuming that the program has worked, that the forbearance program has kept people out of foreclosure for just the right amount of time for the economy to pick back up. So the 10% scenario just sort of assumes that there will be, it's a more optimistic result, and that's reflected in this result, in this data. I'm not sure how realistic the more optimistic result is. I mean, we have Delta flying around, so you know, I don't, there's still a lot of unemployment in leisure and hospitality, for example, in some personal services jobs. So people who rely on that income may also have needed these programs, but these programs are expiring. We also have this 50% scenario, also an unlikely result, but that's sort of assuming that not only have we not waited long enough, but somehow the things are much worse, that the economy has not recovered generally, and that seems like an unlikely scenario as well. So I would so in constructing our forecast, what we sort of focus on is the 25% scenario, which again reflects what we've seen in history. The final thing I want to mention about this slide is that the people who are final two things. The first point is that this is another moderating influence on house price growth. So we've seen a bunch of those so far. I've talked about how the age demographics will moderate house price growth because the cohort that's just now entering the peak home buying age is a little bit smaller than the one that we have now. So age is the demographics are moderating. Interest rates, which will likely rise, will moderate house price growth. And here's another moderating influence, this inventory that will probably be added to the for sale market. And it's important to note here that foreclosures, it may not, I guess foreclosures are not even likely as these programs expire because home equity has risen so much. People have so much in home equity that they can sell their house and not and pay off their bills and not have to worry about short sales or damage to their credit. All the things that happened, in other words, 15 years ago when the bubble burst. All right. The final point I want to make about this slide is that the people who are benefiting from this program are mostly low-income homeowners. So those are the people who benefit from most government programs, mostly low-income residents. And so the supply that could be added to the market as these programs expire, that might bring needed relief to low-income home buyers. So I'm going to take another minute here to explain what's going on this slide. The conclusion of this slide is pretty obvious because the pattern is so striking. But how I created this slide, I think, is worth dwelling on. So what I did is I looked at all of the counties in the nation. I live in Prince George's County, Maryland. I know a lot of you live in King County, Washington. Cook County, Illinois. All of the counties in the nation with 10 zip codes with at least 1,000 households. So there's about 400 and some odd counties that meet that criteria, and it equals about 70% of the nation's population. So most people live in a county with 10 zip codes that have at least 1,000 households. So I looked at those zip codes and I divided the income for those zip codes into deciles. So I looked at the lowest decile, the second, the lowest 10% of zip codes by income were in the first decile. And then the second 10% of homes of zip codes by income were in the second decile, and third and fourth and so on until we got to the 10th and highest decile. So I did that for all of the separate counties. So Prince George's County, Maryland has its 10 deciles. Harris County, Texas has its 10 deciles. Maricopa County, Arizona, they all have their 10 deciles. Then I averaged all of the family incomes in those deciles. So when you average all of those lowest deciles, you get a little bit more than $60,000 in mean family income for the lowest income deciles. You do it for the second decile, you get a little less than 80,000. All the way up to the highest decile, you get about 200,000. So again, every county is contributing about 10% of its zip codes to each of these dots. Every county is doing that, and that's important because it's not the case here that high-income counties are dominating the high-income zip codes, or low-income counties like perhaps Orange County, Florida, Orlando, where there's a lot of leisure and hospitality jobs. They're dominating these low-income zip codes. That's not the case. Each county is contributing about 10% of its population to these zip codes, and what that has the effect of doing is controlling for the county's fixed effects. Fixed effects like things that don't change in the county over time are averaged away when we do this sort of analysis. So you do that sort of analysis, controlling for things like the job market or geography or local government policy, controlling for those sorts of things. And the next thing I did was average house price growth in those same deciles. The lowest decile had 17% house price growth. The next lowest decile had about 16%. And you can see a very, very striking pattern, as I say, that the higher the family income in the zip code, pardon me, the lower house price growth. That is to say that low-income home buyers have been subject to the fastest house price growth over the last year. I did this in May, but the results are basically the same in July. And this isn't just a COVID effect. I want to make that clear. This extra growth that we've had, faster growth in low-income zip codes, that was true before COVID, the year before COVID, 2 years. It's been true the last 7 years. So this is what we have. So we've reached a situation where the fastest house price growth has been in the lowest income zip codes, and frankly, these buyers need relief. And so when these programs, these forbearance programs expire, it's likely that these very buyers, the ones who've been subject to this intense growth, these very buyers will benefit even more so from those expirations. The sellers, they'll be, I mean, again, if you believe that there's been a lot of equity buildup over these last several years, the sellers should also be fine, but the buyers who need relief from all of this extra growth will benefit as well. Whew. All right, so that's a lot. Let me now move on to observations about the Pacific Northwest. And I want to emphasize here that when I'm talking about the Pacific Northwest, I'm going to be talking about markets in Seattle, Boise, and Portland. I'm talking about the metro area in these cases, not the metro area is defined by the Office of Management and Budget and used by the Census Bureau. So just to give you a sense, we're not talking about individual cities or counties. We're talking about the whole area, the whole metro area when I'm making these observations. All right, and then the forecast when I get to them again are for the next year. All right, so this is important context to start with. We see, well, first of all, let's just sort of level set. Sales have risen sharply over the last, since the Great Recession. That's been true nationwide. The national line is black, the United States, and that's true in these other Pacific Northwest markets that I've selected. Lots of sales. And what I've done here is so that you can't put sales in the U.S. the whole country on the same graph as sales with, individual cities. And in fact, you can't really put Seattle's graph on the same, using the same scale as Boise. So what I've done is I've indexed everything to March 2020. So this should say actually March 2020 equals 100. So that's the month that COVID started, and I set that value equal to 100. And what you can see across the nation, the black line in each of the Pacific Northwest markets, right after COVID, there was a decline in sales. No one's going to be surprised by that finding. The decline was actually, though, was fairly temporary. It increased by the end of the year. Sales had peaked, had moved out of that dip that was created by COVID, and they've been sort of increasing ever since. So we have sales here growing in most of these markets up to a record point. I should have pointed out earlier that what I'm looking at here is at a 12-month average. There's a lot of seasonality in housing markets generally. Home sales are generally greater in the spring, much less so in the winter. So that seasonality is accounted for when you do a 12-month average. That's what I've done here. And you can see that 12-month average has increased, but look at what's happening in the very, very latest data points. It looks like it's just beginning to slow, just now beginning to slow down. We also see, and this is an important point to make, that in Boise, that slowdown started happening a while ago, back at the beginning of 2021, beginning of this year. Now, why is that important? In the face of these other markets still increasing, we see sales declining in Boise. And that's crucial because it's crucial to note that in Boise, house price growth has been 40% year over year. It's the fastest growing housing market in terms of prices of the 900 and something that we measure. 40% is remarkable. And what's apparently happening in Boise is that this is what economists worry about. This is the reason why hyperinflation is a problem generally. When people expect prices will be higher tomorrow than they are today, if you're a seller in that situation, well, you'll just wait and sell tomorrow. I mean, selling today when you can sell it for even more tomorrow doesn't make much sense to you. And that's why, despite this rapid increase in prices, sales in Boise have been declining. It's because people are expecting prices to be even higher tomorrow. So and because of that, people are there's less supply coming into the market, and that sort of becomes, and so when you get higher prices, it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, it's an issue that this is the reason why why we have the Fed, why economists are so focused on beating back inflation whenever they see it, because you have the situation where producers, or people who are in charge of selling into a market, will be reluctant to do so when they see prices rising so fast. All right. So we talked earlier about whether or not this was a supply or a demand problem, whether or not supply was supply was low or demand was high. Also was wondering what's explaining this observation that we get a lot of houses coming onto the market, but inventory is still so low. Well, here's the payoff to that quandary, those two questions. So what we see here is that homes are selling faster than they've ever sold before. So there's a lot of supply coming onto the market, but rather than lingering on the market for a week or two, the way that you kind of expect, the way that is normal, homes are flying off the shelves, I guess. I don't know if that metaphor makes a lot of sense in the context of a house. It's difficult to put a house on a shelf. They're flying off the lots. Again, maybe that they're selling really fast. So we have in Portland and in Seattle and Boise, especially, so these Pacific Northwest markets, homes are selling in about a week. So you list the property for sale, and a week later, you found a buyer. You take the home off the market. It went to pending. So so because of that, it's clear that as much supply is being added, and the supply is being added at a normal pace, that supply is just being eaten up. So it's demand that is really elevated, based on this observation. And then the other thing that it's worth noting is that it's that the reason why why we have this, high level supply but low level of stock is because the supply is going so quickly. So this sort of explains those quandaries that I introduced earlier in the presentation. All right, I do want to sort of move it along because I know we might want to have some time for questions. So I want to point out here that we have fewer sellers making concessions. So again, the same idea that I just dwelled on, that it's a seller's market, and that's clear from the share of homes that are taking a cut, where the seller, after a while, you don't even have time to make a concession if the home is being sold in a week. So that's happening nationwide. Seattle now is actually sort of surpassed U.S. In that measure for the first time. All right, and now we get finally to some forecasts. So here we see that house prices. So this is record house price appreciation, the 15% that I talked about, and we're going to see that start. Well, it looks like it eked up to, by some measures, it looks like it eked up to about 20%. So that's in the very latest quarter. This is the year-over-year Zillow home value index. All of this data, by the way, is available at zillow.com/data. And you can see that that house prices should start to moderate. I mentioned all of those moderating factors and all of those slides in the forecast section. That moderation should happen imminently. We should see house price growth start to slow in this month and in the next several months. And you can see in Boise that slowdown will be even sharper. And this is because of the point that I was trying to make, that there are a lot of homeowners who are apparently holding supply from the market, waiting for the for house prices to sort of reach their peak. And as house prices slow, a lot of those homeowners, we expect, will rush to the market, and that will bring prices down in Boise faster than in other areas. But you notice that even with that sharp decline, house price growth will still be elevated by any standard. In Boise, it'll be higher than the rest of the country, and in other areas in the Pacific Northwest. And even in the rest of the country, we were talking about 10%, so still double-digit house price growth even after a year of slowdown. So if our forecast is right, we'll see, which I believe it is, I should note that we'll see house prices continue to grow at above average, not the record pace that we're seeing now, but at an above average pace for the next little while. And then what does that mean for house price levels? You can see that Seattle is one of the most expensive housing markets in the nation. It actually is the most expensive housing market of the ones that we track in the Pacific Northwest. Seattle's going to continue. It's going to be even more expensive. People in Boise, I think, it's hard to imagine a housing market just, 7 years ago, house prices in Boise were about the same as they were nationwide, but now they're 2 times higher than the rest of the nation. It's incredible. And what we see over the next year is that they'll even overtake Portland. All right, so I'm just going to leave you with a few takeaways. Mainly, I want to emphasize demand is a bigger factor than supply. House price, as we've seen now, it's still going to grow, but it's going to slow from this record pace, and we'll see rapid deceleration in Boise. All right, for more details, here's some of how you can find out more about what we do and how to get data from us, Zillow.com/research, Zillow.com/data. All right, I guess you guys have probably heard enough of me. So maybe I can hear a little bit from you all.
Kwame, thank you so much for the amazing information and data in your share. It was awesome. I did have several questions that were texted to me, put on the chat here, etc. The first question I had was, over the conference over the last couple of days, all we've heard about is the markets that most of us are in, which is the Pacific Northwest and how they are on fire in Boise, etc. You're an economist and your data is nationwide. And you talked about all these people moving to zip codes, 25 grand less, bigger houses. So if we wanted to run and buy an affordable house, what is the #1 most affordable market in the nation right now?
The most affordable market in the nation. Well, we don't usually get questions on that end of the spectrum. I think I'm going to have to, pardon me, I don't have the answer to that question. I'm going to be honest. But my email address is kwamed@zillowgroup.com. So for the person who asked that question, if you email me, I will send you, I mean, of course, we have the data on Zillow.com/data, but never mind. I will send you that answer, the most affordable housing market in the nation. My guess is it's going to be someplace in the Midwest. Those tend to be more affordable generally than other parts of the nation.
Okay, fair enough. We have a question in the chat from Mike Gagel. I'm at Factual Data. We know that the elevated demand is backed up and will persist for some time. My question is, how long until the inventory even starts to catch up?
That's a very good question. So some of that will depend on home builders, of course. Home building is an important part of the housing supply, and home builders face their own set of challenges. If it's because of higher lumber prices, which of course have come down a lot lately, labor costs are elevated, and so is land costs. So it does depend on home builders. It also depends on, so a lot of economists answer questions with "it depends." So I'm not going to be an exception. And it also, of course, depends on the existing home sale market. So where do we find homes that are where people are more likely to perhaps leave or move? So my answer is that, so if you're looking for places where the housing market is likely to loosen more because there will be more supply coming to the market, I would look at, first of all, I would look away from places like San Francisco or Seattle, places that not only have elevated demand, but also where the physical space, there's a lot of, is limited by oceans or mountain ranges or other regulations. I would tend to look at places like Texas, where there is more land, where homes are easy to build, and where regulations are a little bit less onerous. So Texas, perhaps Georgia, other parts of the South.
Awesome, thank you. I did have a question here. I don't know if you can answer this. I know you're new to Zillow, and I'm sure as an economist, you probably question. I would say that a high percentage of Americans, when they decide where they're going to go to try and figure out what their home is valued at, they go to Zestimate. Can you share with anybody on the call what the algorithm is behind the Zillow Zestimate and where the data comes from?
Well, I can tell you the data comes from comparable sales mostly. We look at homes that are sold near to the homes that is in question, and we base our assessment on those comparable sales. Now, as you mentioned, I am fairly new to Zillow. I've only been here a couple of months. I haven't delved much deeper than that into the algorithm. But I will say this: it is an algorithm that we're constantly improving. So as as conditions change, as more information becomes available, it's something that we are fine tuning all the time.
Okay, fair enough. I do have another question, and I'll add a little bit to this question. It says, do you see an increase or decrease in second homes for vacation or passive income? I also know that we're starting to see in areas like Chelan, et cetera, in our state, where we have local ordinances being put in place where they're going to restrict Airbnbs and the purchase of new second homes, or rentals. Can you share on second homes?
Sure. So I actually have done a little bit of research on this in my previous job when I was at Moody's, and the source for data on second homes is the public source is the Housing and Vacancy Survey, the HVS, the Housing Vacancy Survey, and I just want to note that survey has been it's been under a lot of pressure over this last year because they had to change the way that they did the survey collection because of COVID, and so a lot of the data, the latest data, isn't comparable to data from previous vintages. Data from 2020 in particular is a little less reliable. So I'll just say, based on the research that I've done on using the HVS and on data going before 2020, what you generally find is that the demand for second homes increases as the economy is just coming out of recessions. So around this time, when the economy is just picking up steam, that's when you find, I should say that what you find is demand in places with a lot of second homes. So vacation spots like Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, or it sounds like you mentioned one of the Pacific Northwest. Those places you can see a clear increase as recessions just after the end of the recession. So we are right now just after the end of the recession. So if current trends are like what we've seen in the past, again, I don't have the data because of the problem with the HBS, but I would certainly expect that second home purchases would rise. But there is a difference, of course, with this as we come out of this recession. We don't usually have 15% house price growth coming out of recessions. It's usually coming out of recessions is when house price growth is slowest. And so it's likely the case that with housing rising so fast, people who can obviously wait to buy a second home, I mean, they don't need a second home for meeting their current housing needs. I mean, those people will likely just wait. They don't want to enter a bidding war for a second home, bidding against someone who's buying that home for their primary residence. So I guess, so my answer is that generally coming out of recessions, you find a lot of extra demand for second homes. There, I guess, are reasons to believe that would not be the case right now. I guess sort of in general, what I would suggest is second home demand will probably rise when we're not being crowded out, when ordinary demand is not being crowded out by, I don't know, people making purchases, in the ordinary market, the people buying the homes for their own personal use.
Well, thank you. Kwame, I am getting blown up on my cell phone with questions for you. You have been kind enough to share with the group your email address, and we appreciate that. So they're getting very technical on the questions right now. So your data and your presentation was amazing. I want to thank Kwame Donaldson and Zillow for being involved in our conference today. Your data, it has a different look and feel than some of the other economists we heard, and it was really great. So thank you for taking your time and presenting to us today. And thank you, Zillow, for being part of our conference. I'm gonna, at this point in time, thank you, Kwame, and you have an amazing day. And I'm gonna now finish up where I started before we bring on the next speaker. And Mindy, is Leah on? Leah, are you there with your microphone off? I started to say, perfect. So I started to say, it is so important, obviously, for people to show up for this conference every year. And this conference, we are on the 44th annual conference in the state of Washington. And next year, we will be handing the baton to our friends in Idaho, because it does rotate from Washington to Idaho to Oregon. So I'm going to hand this over to Leah, who's going to have the save the date and speak for a couple minutes about the Pacific Northwest Lenders Conference in 2022. Take over, Leah.
Thank you, Robert. First of all, I'd like to commend you and Mike and the rest of your committee on the content of this year's conference. I think you've done a great job. The speakers have been awesome, and we hope to aspire to that next year. Given that, God willing, and getting this pandemic behind us, we plan to be in person. Save the date for September 12th through the 14th. We will also be starting our registration the day before for those of you who want to come in early for any of the optional activities we may have Monday morning. We will be once again at the Grove Hotel in downtown Boise, and I will get more information out to our partners in Washington and Oregon when the registration dates open up and the hotel is ready to start taking reservations for us. We're starting to vet speakers. There's a fairly large contingent of us from Idaho Mortgage Lenders Board going to national next year or next month in San Diego. So we're going to be looking at some of the new national regulatory players that are in our market and see what kind of dynamic schedule that we can put for everybody next year. I will shoot my email out to Mindy and she can get that out to your members in case anyone has any questions in the meantime, but stay tuned and just mark your calendar for September 12th through the 14th next year.
Thank you, Leah. If you're not aware, Montana has an association that's fired up. I spoke at it last month or a couple months ago, and I think we need to start getting those guys involved in the Pacific Northwest Lenders Conference. So thank you so much. We are excited for 2022. At this point, we'll be wrapping up session number 1. And once again, I'd like to thank Flagstar Bank for sponsoring Zillow and Kwame Donaldson. I will hand over the microphone